Multi-hazard, all about protecting communities.
As the climate changes for the worse, how can we protect the health of our communities? And how much will it all cost? Join Dylan Clark, Senior Research Associate at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, the network of experts producing independent research to bring clarity to the climate policy choices ahead for Canada, and Multi-Hazards podcast host Vin Nelsen as we discuss the challenges facing Canada and countries worldwide in our adaptation to climate change and the costs we will have to pay. Have a listen. Hello, dear listeners. This episode is where I have a great conversation with Dylan Clark, Senior Research Associate at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. But first, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of the awesome First Nations groups who live around me here in Greater Vancouver on the west coast of Canada, and they have been here since time immemorial. So here's the bio for Dylan Clark, Senior Research Associate at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Dylan specializes in adaptation policy development and climate change inputs across the North. His experience includes leadership on community-based projects and research on Arctic security, vulnerability modeling, and climate impacts on health. Dylan has previously worked as an adaptation analyst for the Government of Yukon and a program manager for the Climate Change Adaptation Research Group. Dylan holds a Master of Science in Geography from McGill University. And for his organization, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices is an unparalleled collaboration of experts from across the country. They undertake rigorous and independent research, insightful analysis, and broad engagement to bring clarity to the climate challenges and transformative policy choices ahead for Canada. So just a quick note, this was done in 2 takes, so the audio might be a little bit different at the second half than the first half, okay? So just to let everybody know. Thank you. And now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Hello, everybody. This is the Multi-Hazards podcast, and I am very thrilled to have Dylan Clark from Climate Choices. And sorry, hi, Dylan. How is everything going with you? And sorry, I just need to get, what's the long name of Climate Choices? I always forget.
It's good to be with you. It's the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices.
Okay, because I remember the website is Climate Choices. So, and I was looking into your bio, Dylan, and I saw that you've got a very deep history in climate change adaptation, right?
So I've been involved in adaptation policy and adaptation research for a bit over 5 years now, and initially came to the adaptation space as many do through emergency management. I was working as a critical care paramedic and became more and more interested in more the policy side of how do policies influence health, and particularly how environment and social policies influence health of people. And one thing led to another, and have been happily working in the adaptation space for quite a while now, particularly working in northern regions and working in Yukon and Nunavut especially.
Okay, great. Yeah, because for me, this is like at night when I sleep, I dream of climate adaptation. It's like that's what I want to invest the next few decades of my life. So when people are into it, and it's not a really popular topic, I mean, so it's just so great. Now, I'm just wondering, Dylan, how have you and the people around you been coping with this pandemic, which maybe it's going to end, but it seems like it's still hanging on?
Yes, certainly. I have been lucky to have been able to make my way through the pandemic with a lot of the blessings that come with a steady job and living in a good city like Vancouver. So count my blessings, absolutely. Certainly, like everybody, have been working on figuring out what the new balance is and how to navigate, the uncharted territory that we're in. I think certainly have been thinking a lot about how we consider risks and what adaptation means a lot this last year. And, the pandemic has put a lot of those issues, equity and risks and public health, really at the forefront of my mind, as well as I'm sure many others across the country.
Right. Yes, it's been a very tough time for many people and a time to reflect and to change. So now you're working at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. I finally found it in front of me here. And I believe your institute has done many reports, but you've had one in early June. It's called The Health Costs of Climate Change, How Canada Can Adapt, Prepare, and Save Lives. Now, I'm just wondering, what is the gist of this report?
So this report is the first report, or second report, I should say, in a series that's looking at the costs and impacts that climate change could have to society. And part of the objective of this series is to shed light on the magnitude of the issue. We talk about some fairly substantial social and economic costs in this report that you mentioned related to health, but we know that the costs, both monetary and non-monetary, are already large, and as we show in this report, getting even larger. And so wanted to show the magnitude of that, and also wanted to describe the importance of adaptation and show what opportunities there are to kind of shift course, as it were, and navigate this risky terrain and steer to safer waters.
Right. And I'm just thinking that for people living here, it's really in our minds now, because we had a heat wave, for example, it's like 3 or 4 weeks ago. And then I think a couple of days from now, we're going to have a mini heat wave, not as bad as the one 4 weeks ago, but it's coming home to us. So, wow. Did you survive that heat wave, Dylan? Obviously, but it was hard.
It was challenging. And I think what many people saw, what I certainly observed, was that we're not building our cities and our infrastructure for the climate of today and tomorrow. We're still living in a world where infrastructure has been built for yesterday and the past decades, and that's an issue. We feel that certainly when there's incredibly warm temperatures outside, and I could feel the solar gain in my apartment, and without kind of built-in air conditioning, wasn't able to use that as adaptation. So I think it was a really important example for a lot of people of really what we're facing.
Right, exactly. Now, this report that you've done with your colleagues, now, who are you aiming at primarily? Is it the policymakers here in Canada, or the public, or maybe both?
So the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, primarily our work is focused on equipping decision makers to develop sound policy, evidence-based climate policy. That said, we know that the transformations needed to meet the climate challenges will need all sectors at the table and widespread public support and engagement. And we do think that we can play a role in convening those conversations and building a greater understanding and support for smart climate policy. So a little bit of both. This health report, certainly the recommendations and a lot of the conclusions are talking to governments, provincial, territorial, federal, but we also think that there's really important information in there for engaged citizens that maybe aren't themselves decision makers within a government in Canada.
Right. Now, Dylan, you told the Weather Network, I think it was maybe a few weeks ago, or I can't remember when, but there's this article where you're mentioned, and you said the bottom line is preparing for climate change through adaptation is one of the most important things Canada can do to protect lives and control costs. Now, I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
So what we talk about in this health report that you mentioned that we published in early June is really that there are thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives if we look over decades, and billions of dollars on the line here. Certainly, greenhouse gas emissions reductions are incredibly important to bending that curve in the long run. But a lot of those impacts are already baked into the system because of the emissions that we've released into the atmosphere globally over the past century. And so really what, the power we have, the levers we have are around adapting and how to accommodate the risks that are in our everyday lives increasingly, as well as how to avoid some of those risks. And so that's really, what we focus on the work that my team, the adaptation team, is doing at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices is figuring out how we can adapt better, and particularly for policymakers, what are the levers that can be pulled? How do we pull those levers to build adaptation?
Right. Now, I noticed that it seems the whole gist and angle of this report is to talk about money, right? And so I'm wondering, why is it important to show the projected costs of climate change? Now, I know you talk about lives and health and injuries, but I can see that money is kind of in the background there.
It is. And certainly we talk about money in the full knowledge that for individuals that have lived through floods or fires, or suffered personally or lost family members in those events, that there's no dollar value that can you can put a price on those losses. But what we do try to do is look at the economic costs with healthcare expenditures, for instance, or labor productivity losses, because we know that that's how decision makers are often weighing decisions. So it's incredibly important for governments to spend money efficiently, obviously, and to make sure that decisions are evidence-based, and providing governments with a bit more information about the costs of different decision-making pathways is important information that, until this work, has not really been available widely across Canada. There is a lot of work happening internationally to start to kind of cost out climate change impacts. Certainly we've seen that work in the US, and our European countries have been doing that. But in Canada, there's been less of that. And so we saw it as a really important gap and an important opportunity.
Right. That's very important. I have actually an acquaintance who's a city planner, and there's this field called asset management where they're doing exactly what you're saying, but just at a micro level, at a kind of hyper local level. So that is really awesome. Now, one part of this report that I really loved is that it focuses on the most vulnerable, who seem to be forgotten time and time again. And the people with resources and power, it doesn't seem they'll be as affected as the people who don't have the resources and power, because vulnerable populations, they actually need this in our society. They need a laser focus. Because, for example, we were talking about this air conditioner. I just read today in a news report saying that only 40% of people here in our province of British Columbia have air conditioners, and they need to put air conditioning as kind of like a part of the health system where they're going to just give them out or lend them out for people to get through the heat wave. So I'm just wondering about this laser focus on the vulnerable, Dylan.
And it gets back to your first question about COVID too. I think, we have seen over the last year how health impacts are not shouldered equally across society, and seeing how housing and jobs or occupations influence the health of individuals across Canada and across the world. And this report embraces that in I think a bit of a new way, but it also is a very old conversation that's been happening in adaptation and vulnerability science for decades, getting back to certainly some of the leaders of the adaptation kind of scholarship in Canada in the early 2000s, talking about the importance of vulnerability and thinking of exposures to risk, sensitivity to those risks, and adaptive capacity. And as you mentioned, certainly adaptive capacity, money and socioeconomic means is one of those factors, ability to buy an air conditioning unit, for instance. But we also know that there's differences in exposure, using the heat wave as an example in Vancouver, thinking about urban heat islands and who is maybe exposed to those hottest neighborhoods during a heat wave. So there's a lot of different dimensions that are incredibly important to be thinking about here. And we talk about them in the report because we also know it's really important that policymakers are thinking of vulnerability as they start to think about policy levers that can be used to increase adaptation and reduce risk.
Okay, wow, that's excellent. So now the report, it focuses on the impact of declining air quality due to ground level ozone, and then secondly, increasing incidence of Lyme disease, and then third of all, the health effects of hotter temperatures. Now, I'm wondering why the report, the authors behind the report, that's you, picked these three things in particular, and I'm wondering what's going to happen with these.
First, I'd say certainly we recognize that these are a very small subset, a tip of the iceberg, if you will, of the broader impacts that climate change can have on health and well-being of people across Canada. We focused on those three areas you mentioned, the ground level ozone, heat, and Lyme disease, because this report really focuses on modeling and quantifying the impacts, the health impacts out to the year 2100. And despite how many impacts we know that climate change will have on health, for instance, mental health impacts on healthcare facilities, the hospitals that we depend on in times of need, there are fairly few impacts that we can actually model out and that we can link up well enough or associate well enough with a climate change variable like temperature to be able to project how climate change will shift mortality rates, for instance. And so that's where we focus on the Lyme disease, the heat-related morbidity, mortality, as well as the ground level ozone impacts. Those are the areas where right now the science is the strongest to be able to model and project out those impacts further. Certainly the report does qualitatively describe the broader impacts that climate change will have on health, and certainly even those impacts we can't put a number to are important, just as important, and in many cases likely even bigger than these ones we can put a number to.
Okay. Now, in the report, you mentioned this term called the social determinants of health, SDH. And I remember taking a course at Yukon University a couple of years ago in climate change, and this was brought up. And I was thinking, I don't think most of the general public, including policymakers, even know what this is. So you put it in the report, and I'm wondering what they are and why they are important.
So similar to the way we think about vulnerability, it's much more than just the exposure that somebody has to, say, heat or smoke. There's a broader context that defines health and well-being of people and of communities. And so when we think about the social determinants of health, we're talking about all of those factors that influence the health of individuals in the population. We're talking about income, certainly, housing, food security, jobs and occupations. And we know that all of that broader fabric of society has, in many cases, a stronger influence on health than, what we generally think of as kind of the bacteria or viruses that we're exposed to day to day. Our health is determined by those social determinants in fundamental ways. And that's why it's important that as we think about building resiliency, we're also thinking about how health and well-being are created and how they manifest across society.
Right. Now, reading your report, I just got the gist, and this is a new term that I've also learned recently about environmental justice. And I can just see the vibes there, even though I don't think you spelled it out clearly. And then the report talks about people who are vulnerable. And I would include, for example, Indigenous folks, people of color, seniors, children, pregnant women, people with pre-existing health conditions, I better get the acronym right here, LGBT2S plus, and differently abled folks, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge list. And an issue is that often they're not represented in decision-making, or maybe it's kind of like a superficial consultation with them or staffing. And then, the first one, they're not represented in decision-making staffing. That means that they're not in those positions of authority. And then secondly, they're not adequately consulted with. So your report, even though it's not spelling it out, it kind of alludes to this. So I'm wondering am I reading this wrong?
Well, first of all, I would say that in the recommendations of the report, we certainly talk about the importance of self-determination and engagement or consultation with rights holders and upholding UNDRIP. And so that gets at some of your question of how we spell that out a little bit more specifically. I would also say, it's not my place to say that somebody is vulnerable. Everybody has vulnerabilities to climate change impacts in one way or another. And certainly some communities that are historically marginalized may have fewer resources to be able to adapt. We talked about that adaptive capacity earlier, whether it's monetary or social networks. And I'd also say that, resiliency is multifaceted, and there are a lot of really important aspects of knowledge, of skills and capacities that each community and individual is bringing to the table here. So I think it's a very nuanced piece, but what we are talking about more broadly with, environmental justice and thinking about climate change is the way that policies have historically marginalized groups and taken away the political and economic means for control and agency. So colonial policies being one example of how historically and today Indigenous communities have lost that agency. And part of building resiliency and building adaptation policy is looking back and undoing and rethinking the way that we go about policies in order to ensure that there is that agency and self-determination.
Right. I know the word vulnerability is kind of sticky. I had a guest a month ago called Tony Hay. She's an Indigenous climate scientist in Australia. And she said, the people there who are Indigenous, they don't like being labeled vulnerable, but in fact, on the ground in daily life, they get neglected. So because of the neglect from government and then the other public there, they end up vulnerable. So it's kind of like a catch-22 situation, right? You are vulnerable, but you can't be labeled it, because that'll make it even worse. And the same goes for the term resilient. Sometimes if you're labeled resilient, it's like, well, they don't need any government assistance then, or any resources. So it's kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. So, yeah.
I think that it's the most important thing here that we're thinking about and working to do as adaptation decision makers is build resilience and reduce vulnerability. And so I think the more we can be specific about where the risks are, or where the susceptibilities are, that to me is where it's helpful. And certainly that's not the job of a Western scientist or somebody sitting in Vancouver to say which communities are vulnerable. It's a conversation, but I think that, once we dig into potentially where those issues are, it's more helpful potentially to name housing insecurity or water insecurity than to just provide potentially a blanket, label for a community, as you're saying.
Right. Now, I think you probably have this in some of your recommendations. So I'm wondering, what are some of the other recommendations that you spell out to policymakers?
So this health report has 4 recommendations, and I'll breeze through them quickly here. The first is that all orders of government should implement health adaptation policies to address both symptoms and root causes of climate related health threats. This really gets at the social determinants question that you asked about. We're thinking about climate change impacts and vulnerability and adaptation in a broader lens, I think, than is historically been used by large governments. We're thinking about public health in a broader lens than just your doctor's office or your emergency room. And so expanding that scope and making sure that policies embrace the broader social context in which health and well-being are created and changed. The second recommendation is that Canada's emerging national adaptation strategy, which is in the works, should map all key adaptation policy levers across government departments and orders of government, so both horizontally and vertically here, against the top climate health impact areas. So again, thinking of that integration and governance of adaptation. And the third recommendation we had was that central agencies and federal, provincial, and territorial governments should explicitly incorporate health resilience into climate lenses to inform cost-benefit analysis and policy decisions. And then the final recommendation was that governments should invest in research in emerging unknown and local climate change health impact areas. So getting at that question you had about why focusing on just these 3? Well, certainly they're important, but we know that there's many others that are important and that deserve additional work and research.
Okay. Wow. Now, I'm wondering, Dylan, what is your final message to the audience about this report and anything else?
The message from this report is really that, climate change is a public health issue, and we need to be thinking of it as such. That doesn't just mean mitigation, it means adaptation. A lot of the impacts that we're seeing from the heat waves, wildfires, or smoke across much of Canada this summer are baked in, and it's certainly important that we're mitigating and reducing greenhouse gas into the future, but those impacts are going to increase over the next few decades, no matter how much we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that is a really critical role for adaptation to play in ensuring that we can reduce the costs, both human and financial, as those risks and disasters increase.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to be on the show. And I wish you a good weekend, Dylan. Take care. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. And that's it. A big shout out to my awesome guest, Dylan Clark, for joining me here today at the Multi Hazards podcast. And an important disclaimer here. First, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific professional or expert advice unless otherwise noted. Second, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that either my guests or I are working with. So, here as I conclude this episode, thanks to you once again, precious listeners, for joining us here today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelsen wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.